European lawmakers have now suspended the approval of the trade deal between the European Union and
This trade bazooka that the EU is reportedly considering using against the US has never been used before. It's considered the nuclear.
Tuesday, French authorities raided the offices of Elon Musk's X in.
Next up, let's shift focus to what's happening in the West. The US has escalated its tussle with Europe over EU's crackdown on American tech firms.
The European Union, France and Germany have slammed US visa bans on European citizens, combating online hate and disinformation.
The tariffs on Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, Netherlands and Finland are set to kick in on February 1st.
We're learning that the United States goes ballistic over this trade deal. US has claimed that European Union is funding war against themselves.
Is in danger of civilizational erasure. And America's goal is to cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory by supporting far-right movements.
The US and the EU used to be the best of friends, but not anymore. Why and how that happened will be explained in this video. But before we start, I have to yap quite a bit to borrow a word my students would use. And as you can hear, I am really sick. That is why this video is late. And if you're here for the first time, yes, this is a German accent. This isn't my normal kind of video. That is why I will refrain from making your typical YouTube intro. Instead, I say that this was really hard to write. And I can already guess that many of you won't be happy with me and what I have to say. But let's start with what shouldn't be controversial. The world is changing drastically and dramatically in our time. No matter where you stand politically, we can probably agree on this point. By its very nature, the United States are at the center of attention. The US is the strongest country in the world, both militarily and economically. Inevitably, however, the European Union also comes into focus. It is not a state, but if it were one, the EU would be the second most powerful country in the world in military and economic terms. This is the reason why together both have shaped the course of world affairs as the West. The changes we are witnessing are to a considerable extent due to the fact that relations between the countries on both sides of the Atlantic have worsened significantly. Many people tend to offer a very simple explanation for this. They point to the current US president and his policies, which in many respects represent a radical break from those of his predecessors. The same is true for the way he communicates. Everything seems to lead back to his name, so much so that any viewer probably already knew, just from reading the title of this video, who was meant by his name. Images from domestic US politics have led many observers around the globe to equate the current US administration with a very specific German government from the past. Some of the images we are seeing are extremely shocking. This includes me. I decided to make this video because I find many of the reactions to the death of a man at the hands of a federal officer deeply troubling. This is where my identity as a German and a European clearly comes to the surface. State violence against its own citizens is a massive issue for us because of the trauma we suffered under the former German government I have already mentioned, and I will not name. But please keep in mind that it is very much still in the living memory of Europe. Furthermore, in Eastern Europe, millions of people suffered under communist regimes. More than 1,000 Germans died just because they wanted to travel to West Germany. When I revealed the idea of this video to the public, I received many encouraging responses. People told me I should speak out. I know that many expect that I attack the current US administration and call them out for plenty of reasons, beginning with being fascist and ending with things that are in certain files. However, I must disappoint such hopes here. I will not be commenting on US domestic politics. Americans do not need a European to explain to them what is right and what is wrong. But I do consider all topics that affect both the United States and the European Union equally to be fair subjects for discussion. I will not discuss the disputes about the US demands for Europe to care for their own defense in detail. There would be several things to say. For example, Germany paid around 1 billion euros in the last years for US soldiers that are stationed here. However, Europe has widely accepted that the US was right to demand Europe to step up, and the EU did. So I consider this dispute as concluded. I will have to touch a little bit on this point to discuss security as a whole. So don't be surprised if it comes back, even so I said here that it is concluded. Also, I am a historian, not a political activist. This matters. It applies to the comparison between the current US administration and the former German government. Such an equation is a political argument, not a historical one. The former German leadership, for example, had clearly defined ideological enemies who are entirely unproblematic for the current US administration. I understand that the comparison is also used to express concern that the United States could be on the path in that direction. But I am a historian, I look backward. My prophetic abilities, on the other hand, are poor. The historical argument I can make in relation to the United States so far is only this. The current administration has caused many deep ruptures with the past. How to evaluate that is something each person must decide for themselves. Of course, I have my own political opinion about all of this, but I can assure you that there are plenty of historians who hold a very different opinion than me. If I use my historical knowledge to try to score some political points, I can promise you others will do the same, just on the opposite side of the field. My job as a historian is to give you information to come to your own conclusions. This means I have to explain how we ended up here without taking a side. I will try my best, but I obviously have a bias. I am European. I am German. I am socialized here. It would be dishonest to claim my European heritage has no influence on how I perceive things. That is why I refuse to mention the names of politicians in this video. We have become far too accustomed to expressing political opinions by supporting specific politicians. A certain French president liking sunglasses is another example, to not just circle back to the US. We are more than that. That is why in this video I will try to find explanations for the growing alienation between the United States and the European Union. Explanations that touch on the roots of our identity. At its core, this is about which norms we uphold in order to make our world understandable. You will find political judgments more than enough on other channels. This is about historical reflections. Let me add two more disclaimers before we start. As mentioned, and as you no doubt will hear, I am German. Therefore, I will work with German examples most of the time when I talk about Europe. I know the most about my country. But this doesn't mean that all of Europe thinks like that, or even that all of Germany thinks like that. Especially when I talk about immigration. Yes, I will go there. People aren't a homogeneous mess. I have to simplify a lot to put this into the form of a video. I don't do this to willingly misrepresent Europeans, just to keep this video manageable. There are many Europeans that feel way closer to the US ways and there are many Americans that prefer a more European approach. Please keep that in mind. The second disclaimer is in regards to a similar topic. I will talk a lot about freedom. This doesn't mean everything I talk about is just about freedom. There are plenty of reasons to explain the present relationship between the US and the EU. I just picked the reason I personally think is the most important source for why we are drifting apart. This has the consequence that it might feel like not as a history video, but a video about the US since 2024. It's not meant like that. We just can see the differences more clearly now. There's a reason I picked one example for a fight between the US and the EU that was passed by the previous US administration. It didn't start with the current one. If you are unhappy with things I say, please call me out in the comments. My only ask is to keep the communication respectful. We are all old enough to know that it won't change a thing to scream at each other in the YouTube comments. So please don't. Enough of the far too long introduction. Welcome back to Lemmy History. For over half a century, we were more than just allies. The US and Europe were the twin pillars of the free world, united by a shared victory and a common enemy. The United States and Europe bound together by a belief in democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. From the Berlin airlift to the fall of the wall, the transatlantic partnership basically defined the last half of the 20th century. It was a story of unity, of a West that stood together. But that was then. In the last few years, that foundation has cracked. It's not just one thing, but a series of deep, fundamental disagreements that are pushing two of the closest allies in history to a breaking point. The friction isn't just about trade or passing political bets anymore. It's about what it even means to be free. It's about the rule of government, the power of the state, and the very words you are allowed to say. This isn't just a political drift. It's a philosophical breakup. Centuries in the making that's finally reached its boiling point. So, how did we get here? How did we lose each other? This is the story of two diverging visions of the West, a tale of how the United States and Europe, once inseparable, are now carving out a starkly different path. And it starts with the most basic yet most contested idea of all.
Do not have the right to shut down someone else's talk and decide for everyone else who they are allowed to hear.
At the heart of the growing schism between America and Europe is a question that's both incredibly simply and impossibly complex. What is freedom? Both sides believe they are its champion, both pull from the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, both build their modern societies on its promise, and yet today their answers couldn't be more different. This isn't a new disagreement, but for decades, a common Cold War enemy was enough to paper over the cracks. Now, with that enemy gone and new threats on the rise, those old cracks are splitting wide open. The American idea of freedom was forged in revolution and written into the First Amendment of its Constitution. The language is absolute and acts as a barrier to the government. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. This is a framework of so-called negative rights, freedom from government interference. The whole assumption is that speech itself, even awful offensive speech, isn't the main danger. The real danger is a government with enough power to decide what's acceptable. Freedom is seen as a natural right that exists before the state. The US Supreme Court has consistently backed this up, famously allowing a neo-Nazi group to march through a town of Holocaust survivors in 1977. not because it supported the hateful message, but because the principle of protecting speech from government control was seen as more important. The march didn't happen in the end, but the message of the decision was clear nevertheless. The American view is that the best cure for bad speech is more speech, that a marketplace of ideas is the ultimate defense against tyranny. The colonies were founded by people fleeing their homeland. The US was born out of the feeling of governmental overreach. The American dream is the idea that everybody can make it. This very much includes that there is no government coming in between a person and his plans. Now, hop across the Atlantic to Germany and you will find a constitution born not from a revolution against a king, but from the ashes of a totalitarian regime that rose to power democratically. Germany's basic law, the Grundgesetz, is built on a different, more traumatic lesson. Its very first line isn't about government power, but about human dignity. Article 1 states, human dignity shall be inviolable. This isn't just a nice sentiment. It's a supreme legal principle that can and does override other rights, including free speech. Germany's constitution creates what's known as a wehrhafte Demokratie or a militant democracy. This is the idea that a democracy must be able to defend itself against those who would use its freedoms to destroy it. It's a direct reaction to the fall of the Weimar Republic, where the Nazis exploited democratic freedoms to tear down democracy from the inside. The German Basic Law even has specific tools to stop this from happening again. Article 18 allows for the forfeiture of basic rights for anyone who abuses them to attack the democratic order. Article 21 can outlaw political parties that try to abolish that same order. Essentially, the German model says democracy is too precious to be left to an unregulated marketplace of ideas. It places the dignity of people and the survival of the democratic state itself above an absolute right to say whatever you want. In this system, free speech isn't the absolute king. It was the socialist Rosa Luxemburg who put this idea in one pointed sentence after World War I. Your freedom ends where mine starts. And this isn't just a German thing. It reflects a broader European legal tradition. The European Convention on Human Rights, which all EU member states are party to, talks about freedom of expression in a very revealing way. Article 10 guarantees the right, but then immediately qualifies in its second paragraph, saying that using this freedom carries with it duties and responsibilities. It then lists all the reasons speech can be legally restricted. Things like national security, public safety, protecting health or morals, or the reputation or rights of others. That one paragraph is one major source of the transatlantic divide. It gives the state a positive role in policing the public square, a power that is almost unthinkable in the American constitutional system. It allows for the criminalization of things like hate speech and denial of certain things happening during World War II, both of which are largely protected speech in the United States. To an American, this can look like a recipe for censorship, a government empowered to restrict speech based on fuzzy ideas like morals. To an European, it's a necessary safeguard, a recognition that one person's freedom to speak can't become another person's freedom to intimidate, dehumanize, and incite violence. So you have two parallel philosophies. The American approach says we learned that government power is the ultimate threat, so we have to protect all speech to stop tyranny. The European approach, shaped heavily by Germany's experience and the experiences Germany brought over the continent, says we learned that unchecked speech can destroy democracy, So the government must have the power to restrict speech that attacks it. For more than 70 years, this was a mostly academic debate, and boy did we all enjoy it. The alliance was held together by much bigger problems, but in the 21st century the battlefield has changed. It's no longer about tanks rolling through Germany, it's about data, algorithms, and the viral spread of information. And it's in this new digital world that this centuries-old philosophical fight has finally erupted into
earlier, and I didn't answer how is it different between the United States and Europe. Well, you know, it all depends on how high you're looking down from. If you're looking from 10,000 feet, they're a bit different. From 30,000 feet, they look just about the same.
That philosophical split over freedom isn't just about what you can say. It's about who we are and where the boundaries of the community lie. Nothing exposes this divide more clearly than the transatlantic clash over immigration. All people who read the script as a control instance before I start recording were angry with me for this chapter, but for very different reasons. So I decided to just go with it. But please remember, I simplify, and of course there are a lot of people disagreeing with me in Europe and in Germany as well. While both the US and Europe grapple with massive demographic shifts, their anxieties spring from different ideological wells. The European view is often filtered through the lens of the collective. Most European nations are built on the foundation of the nation-state. Societies where identity, language, and the state are tightly woven together. Here the focus is on social cohesion. When Europeans debate immigration, the official focus is often on the state's ability to integrate newcomers into this specific fabric. This goes back to the late Roman Empire, which was unable to successfully integrate the German tribes flooding in. Politicians often look at the numbers through a lens of management. In Germany, even after the massive migration shifts of the last decade, the Muslim population is far smaller than often anticipated. Most estimates place it in the single digits, around 6 to 7%. From a top-down collective viewpoint, the argument is often that the system is robust enough to absorb these numbers without the social glue dissolving. The state acts as a curator using managed programs to bring groups into the fold. The fear isn't just for the individual, but that the collective social contract, the high-trust, welfare-heavy society, might break if the cultural consensus shifts too fast. But again, Europe is deeply divided on this too. But it is worth remembering that displacement is still in the living memory of Europeans. We tend to see refugees in a sympathetic light. The American perspective, however, is increasingly rooted in a different fear: the breakdown of the legal social contract. Because America is an idea state rather than an ethnic state, its citizens often view the border as the ultimate symbol of the law itself. Here, the focus is less on whether a group can blend in and more on whether the individual's right to a secure rule of law society is being upheld. For many Americans, an open or unmanaged border isn't just a policy failure. It is an infringement on the individual's citizens' right to have rights. It's seen as a violation of the agreement between the government and the taxpayer. While Europe worries about the stability of the group, America worries about the protection of the sovereign individual from perceived chaos or the dilation of the specific American way of life. This creates a massive disconnect. Europeans may see American demands for walls and deportations as individualistic or even cruel. Americans may look at Europe's state-managed integration and see it as naive collectivism, a government prioritizing a global collective over its own citizens' security. One side sees a manageable social process, the other sees a fundamental breach of the contract between the state and its citizens.
Is the possibility that troops might be used to take Greenland?
Yes, it's an option, the White House said.
The philosophical split doesn't stop with people. It extends to the very land itself. And no single event led this bear more than the 2019 American proposal to purchase Greenland. Famously, the idea has come up again in the last year, escalating to the point that many people feared the US could take it by force. The struggle for Greenland is, in fact, a perfect illustration of the clashing worldviews. From the American perspective, the logic is transactional and rooted in self-interest. Greenland holds immense geopolitical significance, a strategic location for military positioning in the Arctic, and a potential treasure trove of rare earth minerals crucial for modern technology. To the US, acquiring this land was and is framed as a direct boost to its national security. It's a viewpoint that prioritizes America's freedom to be secure, treating sovereignty and territory like a real estate transaction. If an asset is critical for individual security, then acquiring it is a valid goal. The US has acquired territory before. Its European countries were the sellers. So why shouldn't they do it again? In this calculus, Europe's freedom to own this land is in direct competition with America's freedom to ensure its own secure existence, especially if the US is willing to pay a fair price and there's precedent in the past. In Europe, the reaction was not just rejection, but disbelief and offense. Denmark to Greenland is an autonomous territory called the idea absurd. Many people had far more colorful descriptions, but there is no need to get crass. For Europeans, the proposal was and is an attack on the basis of a common good. Land isn't just a commodity to be bought and sold, it's a home to people, a piece of a shared culture, and part of a collective identity. The suggestion that a nation and its people could be purchased struck at the heart of the post-war European project, which is built on the inviolable dignity of peoples and the sovereignty of nations. The idea was seen as completely at odds with modern international law and norms. The EU stood in full solidarity with Denmark and the people of Greenland, reinforcing the idea that this was not a bilateral issue with Denmark, but an affront to the entire European community. Their own land is for Europe the core of freedom, security and wealth. Again, remember that displacements and the loss of land is still in the living European memory. The Greenland affair reveals two fundamentally different concepts of the world. The US sees a strategic asset, a piece on the global chessboard to be acquired to enhance its individual security. Europe sees an inalienable homeland, part of a community of nations whose value could not be measured in dollars or euros. Of course, Europe also does power politics and America also understands sovereignty, but they justify it in very different moral languages. The incident proves that even the very ground beneath our feet has become another source of transatlantic misunderstanding. The same is true for the world we can't actually touch, but which shapes our perception of the present more than any other. The internet was supposed to connect the world. For the US and Europe, it's doing the exact opposite. This new digital landscape has become the main arena where their fundamentally different ideas about freedom are clashing, creating what some are calling a digital Iron Curtain. The catalyst for this conflict is a huge piece of European legislation, the Digital Services Act, or DSA.
Welcome everyone to today's hearing on Europe's threat to American speech and innovation.
The DSA was adopted in 2022 and became fully applicable to all platforms by February 2024. Along with its sibling, the Digital Markets Act, DMA, it represents the EU's big attempt to impose its vision of a safer internet. The goal is to force the largest online platforms, think Google, Meta, X, TikTok, to take more responsibility for the content they host. The law makes them aggressively police and remove illegal content as defined by member states' laws, which can include anything from terrorist propaganda to disinformation and hate speech. It demands more transparency from their algorithms and gives regulators the power to hit them with massive fines, up to 6% of a company's global turnover, if they don't comply. From Brussels, this is seen as a historic defense of democracy. EU officials argue they are protecting citizens from harm and holding unaccountable tech giants to a standard of basic civic duty. They push back hard on accusations of censorship, with officials insisting the DSA is content agnostic and meant to advance users' rights. They point to Europe's living memory of totalitarianism as the real motivation, arguing it's about stopping the digital world from being used to undermine their societies. But in Washington, the DSA is seen with deep suspicion, if not outright hostility. It's viewed as an attempt by Brussels to export its more restrictive speech rules to the rest of the world, effectively censoring Americans by proxy. Since most of the targeted companies are American, the US government sees the law as both an economic attack and an assault on core American values. The criticism has been sharp. The US House Judiciary Committee has argued the DSA is being used to target core political speech, humor, and satire, and infringes on American free speech. The FCC was even more blunt, calling the DSA's approach incompatible with our free speech tradition in America. The conflict isn't just talk. The House Judiciary Committee has subpoenaed major tech companies and published reports accusing the EU of weaponizing the DSA to compel global censorship. This represents a major escalation, moving way beyond a policy disagreement and starting to treat an ally's regulations as a hostile act. This is where the philosophical divide crashes into reality. An American tech company in Europe now has to follow the DSA. That means building a system to take down content that's illegal in Germany, like some forms of hate speech, even if that same content is perfectly legal under the First Amendment in the US. These companies are now caught between two masters. Do they create one global standard that follows the strictest rules, basically applying European speech norms to their American users? Or do they try to geofence content, creating a fractured internet, a splitternet, where what you can see and say depends on which side of the Atlantic you are on? This isn't a hypothetical problem, it's happening right now, and it's a compliance nightmare. But the financial cost is secondary to the ideological one. For many in the US, the real problem is the idea of a government bureaucracy deciding what is true and what is acceptable speech. The EU's response is that this is simply the cost of doing business in a democratic society that values more than just total free-for-all. They see it as an issue of digital sovereignty, the right of the EU to set its own rules for its own digital space. The result is a rapidly growing split. The US pushes for a deregulated pro-growth tech environment, afraid that anything else will kill innovation. The EU pushes for a values-based regulatory system, afraid that anything else will harm democracy. One side fears a government bureaucracy stifling thought, the other fears an unregulated digital mob tearing down society's foundations. They are talking past each other because their definitions of words like freedom, harm and safety just aren't the same anymore. The Digital Services Act didn't create this problem, but it has dragged a deep, latent philosophical disagreement kicking and screaming into the open. Next, we are going to look at how this philosophical rift is spilling over into the economy and global security, areas where the US and EU have been joined at the hip for decades. The story only gets more complicated from here. If you're finding this analysis valuable, take a second to subscribe. Your support helps me make more content like this, moving beyond the headlines to understand the why behind the news.
Challenge, for sure, the measure has no cap, and so the amount of money is probably growing and growing.
For decades, the transatlantic economy was the engine of global prosperity. It was built on a shared belief in free markets, open trade, and fair competition. But just like with speech, the shared language of capitalism now hides two very different dialects. The United States and the European Union are drifting into separate economic orbits, driven by clashing views on the government's role in the economy. This isn't just about tariffs on steel or fights over cheese, it's a structural uncoupling that kicked into high gear with one key piece of American law, the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. Signed into law in 2022, the IRA is, on its face, the biggest piece of climate legislation in US history. It pours hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies and tax credits into supercharging the green transition, encouraging American production of electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, and more. Some of this has been revoked. From the American side, it's a simple and necessary industrial strategy. Fight climate change, cut dependence on China, and create good American jobs. In Europe, though, the IRA landed like a declaration of economic war. The law's provisions are written to heavily favor products made in North America, a Buy American approach that European leaders immediately called discriminatory, protectionists, and a violation of world trade rules. France was especially vocal, warning the IRA could fragment the West. The fear in Brussels, Paris, and Berlin was real. That European companies already hit with high energy costs would be tempted to move their factories and investments to the US to get a piece of the subsidy pie, gutting Europe's industrial base. The IRA put the philosophical divide on full display. The American model, even when it uses massive government spending, is all about unleashing the private sector. The government creates the incentive and the market is supposed to deliver the innovation. In contrast, Europe's response showed its preference for a more managed, state-led approach. The EU didn't just file a complaint with the WTO, it fought back with its own plan, but with a very European twist. In 2023, the European Commission announced its Green Deal Industrial Plan, a framework designed to relax state aid rules and allow member governments to pour public money into their own green tech champions. What we are seeing are two rival economic blocs taking shape. On one side, a US system focused on market incentives and a lighter regulatory approach to spark growth. On the other, an EU system that uses strong regulation and strategic public investment to build a managed, resilient economy. This tension has become a pattern. The EU pushes for new regulations with global reach, and US officials argue they act as a drag on trade and competitiveness. This is creating a great divergence for global companies. A firm operating on both sides of the Atlantic now faces two different rulebooks on everything from environmental standards to AI. They have to decide whether to adopt the high regulation European model everywhere or run two separate, expensive operations. For some, the choice might just be to pick a side. To be clear, the economic divorce isn't final. The EU and the US have tried to manage their disagreements through forums like the Trade and Technological Council, TTC, which was set up in 2021 to coordinate on shared challenges. And it has produced some results like agreements on AI terminology and extending cooperation on semiconductor supply chains. At a meeting in April 2024, a task force was even working to address European concerns about the IRA. However, the TTC has mostly failed to fix the biggest problems. No meaningful deal has been reached on the critical minerals needed for EV batteries, a huge sticking point with the IRA. The forum has been better at producing joint statements than real breakthroughs. It has become a way to manage the friction rather than to get rid of it. As of early 2026, the future of the TTC itself is uncertain, with its effectiveness openly questioned. The core problem is still that philosophical gap. Europe sees strong regulation and industrial policy as essential tools for what it calls open strategic autonomy, making sure it isn't dependent on the whims of either the US or China. America, for the most part, sees those same tools as anti-competitive. While they still share the goal of countering China, their ideas for how to do it are pulling them apart. The IRA and the EU's response weren't just policies. They were symptoms of two different economic worldviews. And as they harden into two distinct systems, they are pulling the transatlantic economy apart at the seams.
Anyone thinks here, again, that the European Union or Europe as a whole can defend itself without the US, keep on dreaming.
For 75 years, the foundation of the transatlantic alliance was a simple promise. An attack on one is an attack on all. This promise, written into NATO's Article 5, was the ultimate security blanket, with the United States as the undisputed leader and protector of Europe. But in the last few years, that foundation has started to crumble. A crisis of trust is unfolding, driven by a shifting American focus and a growing European fear that it might, for the first time in generations, have to stand on its own. The turning point wasn't one event, but a slow burn realization in European capitals. The American complaint about burden sharing, that European allies weren't paying their fair share for defense, has got much louder. That pressure has worked. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, European defense spending shot up. By 2024, a majority of allies were finally meeting the decade-old pledge to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. In fact, the conversation in some circles has moved on to even more ambitious targets for defense and security spending. 5% is the new goal. But even with Europe spending more, that anxiety won't go away, because the problem isn't just about money anymore. It's about focus and reliability. America's own core strategic documents, like the 2022 National Security Strategy, makes it clear that the main long-term challenge for the US is not Russia, but China. The strategy talks about connecting alliances in Europe with those in the Indo-Pacific, treating the two as a single linked theater. While still pledging to support European security, the message is unmistakable. Washington's main focus is pivoting to Asia. This has fueled a fierce debate inside Europe about strategic autonomy. Championed for years by France, the idea is that Europe must develop the independent military and industrial capacity to act on its own without having to rely on the United States. For years, this was seen as a fringe idea, especially in Eastern Europe, where countries saw NATO and the US as their only real defense against Russia. But that conversation has now gone completely mainstream. In Germany, there are even discussions about getting their own nukes, which it isn't allowed to have according to international treaties. So a European stage is right now at the center of the discussion. This shows the debate isn't about if strategic autonomy is a good idea anymore, but what it should look like. Should it complement NATO or one day replace it? Is a real European army a possible goal or a dangerous fantasy? The divisions are deep. The Atlanticist camp, strong in Poland and the Baltics, is still skeptical, arguing that nothing Europe can build could replace the power of the United States. They worry that the talk of autonomy could weaken the transatlantic bond. The Europeanist camp, led by France, argues that relying on an America that's increasingly unpredictable and looking elsewhere is strategic suicide. These tensions show a loss of faith in the American security guarantee. The world today poses serious, even existential threats to Europe, and the unpredictability of American leadership only raises the stakes. The feeling in many European capitals is that they are now expected to handle their own regional defense, but within a strategic framework still set by Washington's global priorities. It creates a deep unease. Europe is being told to arm itself, but for a purpose that might not always be its own. The alliance isn't broken. The united and fast response to the war in Ukraine, bringing Finland and Sweden into NATO, and the continued joint military exercises all show the structure still works. But the spirit has changed. While nobody seriously thinks the EU will pivot to China, the search for other partners and the drive for self-reliance are speeding up. The EU has increased its engagement with powers like India, trying to diversify its relationship beyond the old transatlantic axis. What we are seeing is a fundamental shake-up of the post-war security order. The old model, a dependent Europe under a reliable American nuclear umbrella, is over. What comes next isn't clear. It could be a Europe of two pillars, where a stronger European defense acts as a more equal partner inside NATO, or it could be a more fragmented West with the US and EU acting as allied but separate powers, working together when their interests line up and going their own way when they don't. Whatever the outcome, the blind trust that once defined the relationship is gone. The security schism, born from a shift in American priorities and a crisis of European confidence, is forcing both sides to rethink what it means to be allies in a world where they can no longer take each other for granted.
Should take over the leadership of NATO. That was the bombshell announcement from the US ambassador at the recent Berlin Security Conference. Germany has increased its defense spending this year and is rebuilding its army. But are the Germans anywhere near ready to step up and lead NATO?
From the shared values of the Enlightenment to the battlefields of the Cold War, the story of the United States and Europe was for a very long time a story of we. We, the West. We, the free world. Today, that story is being rewritten in the language of us versus them. We have walked through the great divides that have opened up. The demographic divide over who belongs and on what terms, the digital divide, where America's absolute right to free speech crashes into Europe's mission to protect its democracy. The economic divide, where America's market-driven IRA competes with the EU's state-led regulatory capitalism. And the security divide, where shifting American focus has forced a reluctant Europe to finally confront the idea of defending itself. Each of these splits is a big deal on its own. Together, they represent something systematic, but they aren't the cause of the breakup. They are the symptoms. The root cause is, in my opinion, much deeper. A philosophical split that was dormant for decades. It's a fundamental disagreement about the very nature of freedom and the proper role of the state. Is freedom the absolute absence of government restraint, as the American tradition holds? Or is it a right that comes with responsibilities, a right the state has a duty to manage for the sake of collective dignity and democratic stability, as the European model argues? For 75 years, these were questions for philosophers and lawyers. Now they are the urgent practical questions, freezing trade talks, complicating military plans, and turning tech companies in diplomatic battlegrounds. The shared consensus that held the West together has evaporated. Without a common enemy to unite them and with new global challenges pulling them in different directions, America and Europe have fallen back on their foundational instincts. Fixing this will take more than another summit or a new trade deal, if it is even possible. It will require both sides to be honest about just how deep this philosophical chasm has become. It requires them to get that they are no longer playing by the same rules or even speaking the same political language. They are two different answers to the same basic question: how to build a free and prosperous society. The great irony is that in their divergence, both the United States and Europe believe they are the true defenders of the Western tradition. And maybe they both are. But as they drift further apart, each clinching to their own version of freedom, they risk losing the very unity that made the freedom possible in the first place.